Good afternoon. Mic is not on. Good afternoon. I welcome everyone gathered here for this special lecture on US-India economic ties, the next 10 years, by our distinguished guest of our day, Mr. Richard M. Rosso. Without much ado, I request the Vice Chancellor, Professor J. Mahinder Reddy, to kindly make his introductory remarks and welcome the guest speaker.
Richard Rosso, Mr. Gurpreet Singh, Mrs. Shobha Rani Yashasvi, distinguished members of the faculty, participants of the Army workshop on logistics management, which is going on now on the campus, my dear students, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you all to this lecture by Mr. Richard Rosso, Senior Fellow and Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies in the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. A special welcome to the other institutions of ICFAI group, which in 17 cities in the country, who are watching this program through live webcast. Mr. Rosso joined CSIS in 2014, having spent the previous 16 years working in a variety of capacities to strengthen the partnership between the United States and India. He also served as the Deputy Director of the United States-India Business Council, the premier business advocacy group working for strengthening economic ties between the two countries from 1998 to 2008. University of Pennsylvania's Global Go-to Think Tanks report of last year has listed CSIS as the 4th best overall think tank in the world and the number 1 in the world for security and international affairs. At this center, Mr. Rosso succeeded Ambassador Carl F. Inderforth, who had served as the inaugural Wadhwani Chair from 2011 to 2013. Carl Inderforth was the Assistant Secretary of State during the Clinton administration in the United States. Indo-US economic relations in the form of bilateral investment and trade constitute important elements in Indo-US bilateral relations. The Indian community in the United States is one of the largest immigrant population and has contributed significantly to the US economic growth. They are highly educated ethnic group and highest income group among all ethnic groups in the United States. They can contribute to US tourism in India because of their strong roots with India. 20 years ago, there was very little trade between the United States and India, although United States was the number 1 largest trading partner for India, both in terms of exports and imports. United States was the largest country where India was exporting, and the United States was the number 1 country where India was importing. 10 years back, IT services began to grow and became one of the most crucial pillars for economic cooperation. Today, we are hopefully at the cusp of a manufacturing revolution in India to compete with China especially if Make in India concept of the present government is successful. What are the sectors that are likely to dominate bilateral trade and investment 10 years from now? Which of these has the most promise to deliver economic benefits to both the nations? Will it be defense, defense production and technology? Will it be IT? Will it be energy? Will it be pharma? Will it be tourism? Will it be health or others? Which states, this is another question, which states in India will attract the United States investment is another question. As between countries, between states also, it is competitiveness which decides. The government of India is taking up several measures, including the following: to ensure doing business by reducing bureaucratic controls and fixing administrative problems. Number 2, reforms in land acquisition. Number 3, power and coal sector reforms to achieve 24/7 power, and we have got one minister looking after power, coal and renewable energy, Mr. Piyush Goyal. Number 4, easing of FDI limits in defense and insurance. Promote infrastructure, both physical and digital, to make the Indian economy competitive so that Make in India concept becomes operational. All these measures may contribute to increased bilateral trade and investment flows between these two countries. The visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the United States and his public lecture at Madison Square Gardens, which most of you may have heard, and the forthcoming visit of the United States President Barack Obama as the chief guest for the Republic Day of India in Delhi may further strengthen the economic and diplomatic ties between these two countries, resulting in increased trade and investment flows. Without much ado, I request Mr. Rosso to deliver the lecture on this topic, US-India economic ties, the next 10 years. We cannot find a better speaker than this. He has visited India several times. I once again most cordially welcome him to India and to our institute. He has agreed to take questions after the presentation. I therefore request you to write down your questions and pose them after the lecture is over. Mr. Richard Rosso.
Well, thank you all for having me here. You'll notice my voice is a tiny bit scratchy. I've been giving lectures throughout the country and hope to give quite a few more, but the topics are incredible, and the time for doing this is incredible. Between the visit of the Prime Minister to the United States, the forthcoming visit of our President to India, it really feels like relations are on an upside again that we haven't felt in some time. So before looking at what the opportunity might look like in 10 years, it's kind of important to take a look back at where we were 10 years ago and where we are today. It's really important because 10 years, I think, is exactly the right time frame to measure the U.S.-India relationship, particularly on economic issues. I say that mainly because it's not a relationship that necessarily moves fast at all times, but it's moved in a steady, slow progress in exactly the right direction. And too often, especially in Washington, I think in Washington far more than in New Delhi, when you don't see immediate returns on what outreach you do to foreign countries, you tend to give up. You tend to look on to the next country. You look at the next place you want to spend time on. And maybe forgetting those relationships that you began early on. 10 years is a good window. In 10 years, we've seen tremendous progress, and I suspect over the next 10 years, we're going to see quite a bit more. Now, as the Vice Chancellor mentioned, looking back 10 years ago, the United States was India's largest trading partner. And since that time, we've had slow but steady increases in trade. But slow but steady hasn't been enough because U.S. trade with India has actually been surpassed. You have larger trade relationships now with both China and the United Arab Emirates. So slow but steady is not enough to keep this relationship, at least on trade and goods, as your preeminent relationship. We need to look for things that break out of the slow but steady and find ways to move it into a higher trajectory, and I'll touch on some of those in a minute. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why as an American out here at my campus in Hyderabad. Why does America care about economic engagement with India? What's the point? We're two countries very far apart with many oceans and many countries in between. Well, you know, America's interest in seeing India's economic development goes back to the time of your independence. You know, our president at the time, President Roosevelt, was one of the strongest advocates outside of your country for independence and was pushing Winston Churchill like nobody's business to try to make that happen. Now, at the time of India's independence, our main interest in encouraging India's economic development was purely on development interests. It was about trying to stop the toughest scourges that India faced at the time. There was massive famine. There was poverty of a time that nobody could imagine. And so America's engagement with India's economic development at the time of independence was mostly about helping India overcome its most difficult problems at the time. If you want to help anything in the world, spending time working with India farmers at the time and trying to avert famine was one of the best uses of time and energy and resources. Starting in the 1990s, as India began to really liberalize its economy, then a second group started to take a strong interest in India's development, businesses. Now, they don't care about India's development for the sake of development. Business very much wants to come and run a profitable business. But by trading and investing with India, of course, it creates jobs, and I think Hyderabad knows that better than any city in India. The dramatic transformation that we've seen in Hyderabad since the first time that I came almost 20 years ago to what you see today, America played a small but important role in that. We weren't the only reason that Hyderabad, that Andhra Pradesh developed, but we were a small part of it, and we're happy to be so. So American business in the 1990s began to take an interest, of their own self-interest in also encouraging economic development. The more recent and in some ways more interesting development was partially fueled by India's nuclear test back in 1998. America woke up to India's strategic importance. Till that time, I don't think most in America had really kind of realized that India was on a trajectory to actually become one of the dominant players in all of Asia, both militarily as well as economically. So with the nuclear test back in 1998, there were a couple of very important, I think, signals that both sides sent to the other. A year after that, in 1999, your country faced a border war with Pakistan. And for the first time, the United States took a stand strongly with India in that. President Clinton called Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to the White House and gave him a shouting earful that I think everybody could hear from outside the White House. It was so loud. Just a couple of years after that, and of course President Clinton's trip to India a year after that, in 2000, I was here in Hyderabad at High Tech City for his visit, helped organize the business delegation that accompanied the president. And seeing people crowding the side streets, waving flags, believe it or not, America doesn't get that kind of treatment in every place that we go into. So it was great to see it then, and I think that kind of affirmed that there was a sharing of values there that made this relationship quite important. So America's support for India during the Kargil War was a game changer, I think, and it opened up India's eyes that maybe America was going to remove the hyphen and think about India as an autonomous entity rather than always constrained by the India-Pakistan balance. Now, fast forward 2 years later with the election of President Bush in the United States. Even before his election, he knew that India should be placed at a higher priority, I think, than what even his predecessors had imagined. And for those of you that can remember, there was a world before our 9/11 in the United States. What was President Bush's main foreign policy objective the first year that he was in office before 9/11? It was creating a thing called the Missile Defense Shield. We had the technology to build a missile defense shield that we felt could protect us against a nuclear attack by a state actor, back when we thought that it would be state actors that would launch nuclear attacks. Now, of course, we think a little bit differently, but at the time, it looked like a state attack would be the most likely. We felt we had the technology to create a shield that would block any missile challenges, and he was willing to tear up treaties with Russia, with other countries, in order to allow us to create this. And that's exactly the kind of issue that in the United States we expected India would oppose. We thought India always didn't like when the United States would go it alone, when India would prefer to, see the United Nations, the approach of not choosing allies but instead having a multipolar foreign policy. But in this instance, in 2001, India was one of the first countries to step out and support the United States in an interest of developing the missile defense shield. That was the other signal. For us, it was support of India in Kargil. For the United States, it was India's support of this missile defense shield. And that put in motion the things that led to the 2005 launch of U.S.-India civilian nuclear cooperation. So that's when the time that the strategic community began to be interested in India's development. if we want to have a multipolar Asia, if we want to have an Asian future with our multiple centers of power, not just one and not just two, we would like a country whose ideals are very much aligned with the United States, that we have a strong partnership with. And in fact, for India to take that place, preferably sooner rather than later, there's some things that we can do to help encourage that, both in terms of sharing nuclear technology, defense technology, and economic development. To be a superpower in Asia's future, India is going to need to be a strong economic player as well. And again, the United States can't give that, and we won't be the main thing that makes that happen, but we'll play a supporting role. And so most recently, the strategic community decided we needed to take that role. So it started with development, it moved to business, and then into strategic. So those are kind of the three phases on why America cares about India's development. Now, overall, I think, in Washington and in corporate headquarters across the United States, India is still a relatively small player. For the strategic community, there's crises around the world right now, some of which we may have had a hand in actually creating, so many of which we're trying to stop and slow. I think also for the business community, India's progress on reforming the economy and allowing for new opportunities for foreign investment and trade has been slow and sometimes backward steps. But generally across, again, the 10-year time frame, you see slow but steady progress. So India is still, I think, in the United States, punching a little bit below the weight that you'd expect of a country of your size. But again, I think these days we're kind of seeing a big uptick in that again. And I think having such a good set of relations early on in the Modi administration has been very supportive of this. Now, building stronger economic ties, it's not an easy thing. There's political challenges in both countries to a stronger economic relationship. In the United States, for instance, when people talk about economic relations with India, the first thing they think about is outsourcing. And you're probably familiar that in the United States, a lot of people, when they think about outsourcing, they think it's a one-sided fight. Every job that's established in Hyderabad or Bangalore is a job lost in the United States. That's not really the case. This kind of trade flow actually creates economic value on both sides. But it's very simple and easy to say that opening a call center here is a reduction in jobs back in the United States, or a software center here, that kind of thing. Also, the United States actually has a large trade deficit with India. This may you find surprising, but in terms of goods trade, India exports about $2 for every dollar that we export to India. And on the services side, cross-border services trade, is actually, the imbalance is actually a little bit worse. Now, having a 2-to-1 trade deficit isn't a big deal when India is our number 17 trading partner, as it was a few years ago. But now it's number 11. And maybe in a couple of years it'll be number 5, and then number 3, and number 2. And at some point, if this trade imbalance isn't fixed, if America doesn't find ways to export a bit more to India to offset that, it could become a political challenge in the United States as well. And that's something you can see happening over a 10-year horizon. Now, in India, you know far better than I do, there's also challenges towards a full-throated engagement with the United States. When I say the word FDI caps, it's a little safer in Hyderabad, but if I say that in Kolkata, then I might get something thrown at my head. FDI caps is very racy. There's a concern that opening to foreign investment, American companies or foreign companies will take over particular industries. And there's concerns about, the harms that may be entailed in that. Also, there's concerns about competitiveness. Indian manufacturing in particular, I don't think is seen as competitive in a lot of industries versus other markets. And so if markets were opened up automatically, if there were no trade barriers, then would that help or harm India's manufacturing industry? I think the general perception, at least from Delhi right now, is that it could be harmful. So you've got political challenges on both sides towards a deeper economic partnership. Now, when America looks at India and economic engagement, when business looks at economic engagement, there's two different voices that you'll hear. And this is important for you all to pay attention to and understand when you hear things said by American business about the Indian market, which group it is that's speaking. The first group is the policy community that lives in Washington, D.C. primarily. This is the group that on behalf of large American companies spends all day, every day when they wake up and before they go to bed, thinking about how to use government affairs, how to use government engagement to further their own interests. And for the most part, that means complaining about things. Complaining about India's got this barrier here, China's got that barrier there, Thailand's got that barrier. So when you hear about America complaining about the Indian economic environment, a lot of times it's that group who's hired for a very specific duty on behalf of large American companies, which is to complain about the environment and try to change it for the better. And there's a second group, and this is the actual investors, and this is the far more important one for all your lives are concerned. This is the headquarters of companies that decide where to put their next investment. And looking at where those trade flows are going, where the investment flows are going, is far more important for actually creating jobs and unlocking economic value than the policy community. In the latter years of the UPA government, I think both were speaking more or less from the same voice. The policy community said that we're worried about irrational taxation policies. We're worried about forcing us to manufacture locally to win contracts. We're worried about patent decisions. And the business community, the decision makers, were following suit. You know, trade was barely growing, if declining a little bit, and foreign investment really kind of fell off in the last couple of years. I think since the election, since the inauguration of Prime Minister Modi, and seeing some of the initiatives that he plans on undertaking, you're seeing a bit of a divergence. You'll still hear a lot of negativity from the Washington business policy community, saying we got problems with this, we got problems with that, we want to see this change, we want to see that change. But the real business community, they're already coming back to India in a big way, as measured by the only thing that matters, which is the numbers. Foreign direct investment this year is up 24%. Foreign institutional investment, which is passive investment into the stock market, is $40 billion this year versus only $10 billion last year. So already 4 times what it was all of last year. So the real business community is coming back into India in a big way. And I don't think that message, it's certainly not in the United States, but I don't even think in India is really well understood. You still hear the complaints and the rhetoric from Washington, but in fact, the actual business community is coming back to India in a pretty big way. And that I think is pretty heartwarming. So that's kind of where things are at right now. Looking to the future, earlier this year, CSIS, my organization, as well as the partnering with the MacArthur Foundation, did a survey of about 400 policy elites, meaning government, non-government business leaders across all of Asia. What were their expectations for what the Asian future is going to look like in 10 years? And this included both economic as well as security issues. And on economic, I'll say across Asia, every single country said, we expect that in 10 years, China will be our dominant economic partner, that will increase prosperity in my country, but also increase instability. There's only one country in all of Asia that said the answer was a country other than China, and that was India. India's policy elite said, we believe that the United States in 10 years is going to be our dominant economic partner. So again, slow but steady, we've already been eclipsed. If we want to live that reality, which the United States certainly wants, and it sounds like in India people want as well, then we need to find some things that will change the game and move us into a higher orbit. So now is the time that I'll embarrass myself by if you show me this clip in 10 years. We'll take a look at what might happen over the next 10 years. In 2 separate scenarios, what are the things that I think are going to cause incremental change that you can pretty much rely on right now for the better? And then the second is, what are the game changers that could really put that relationship into higher orbit? So look into the things that I know are in process right now that are going to have a positive impact. First, India keeps growing and the U.S. wants a piece of it. Your country just had the slowest patch you've had in a decade and you still grew at 4.5%. That ain't bad. The United States will take that. Our peak, we're looking at 3% or 4% on an annual. And our peak, that's as high as we're going to go. So I think if India continues to grow, even at the floor that you just hit, not to talk about 7-8% that I think is pretty reasonable in the near future, America's going to want to be there. We want to participate in that growth and we want a piece of it. Also, I think India's business environment is starting to merge better with international customs. It's simple things, but when I first started working with your country, again, almost 20 years ago, things like sanctity of contracts. It just has a very different meaning in India than it does in the United States. In the United States, when you sign a contract, you're not allowed to talk about that deal again until the contract is due. And in India, it was generally a business custom where you sign a contract, and if you felt that the value was one-sided after a year or two, you'd start talking about, should we take a look at that? Should we reopen it? And that's happening less and less. I think business customs between the two are slowly starting to merge. I think Indian companies are getting better participation in global markets, and they're having a better understanding. And students like you that are right now in the prime of your, about to move into your careers, are getting a better taste for this kind of thing. It feels like, generally like the environment's moving in the right direction, which is going to give foreign companies, American companies, a little more security and comfort in making those investments in India. The third, and this is a biggie, U.S. liquefied natural gas. India is a net energy importer in a big way. America is about to become one of the largest energy exporters. Shale gas revolution in the United States showing reserves that we couldn't have even dreamed a generation ago. There's two ways that foreign countries, because believe it or not, the United States does have some economic controls as well. There's two ways that foreign countries can actually tap into America's natural gas bonanza. The first is by being a free trade agreement partner. And India is not that, and nor do I think they're going to be in the next 10 years. The second, individual American natural gas terminals for export can get licensed by the federal government to export to non-FTA countries. There's about 30 of these that have applied so far. And of those, a half dozen or so have been granted. And 2 of those have actually dedicated some of their export content to India. Now that doesn't sound like much, does it? 2 terminals on the coast of the United States, boats moving back and forth between the U.S. and India. Those 2 alone are going to meet more than 10% of India's imported gas needs. 2 terminals. So just imagine when the next couple dozen of terminals gets approved, if India signs contracts. It's a commercial deal, so don't press my friends in the U.S. government to give you that gas. They only give the permit for the terminal to export to somebody, and then they got to sign the contract. So there's no way we can just guarantee that India will get it. But you assume in the next couple dozen, India will sign a few more contracts. And America will actually become one of the largest gas suppliers to India. That'll help offset the trade imbalance, but also help India's energy needs. I think some manufacturing will start to shift to China. The Make in India campaign is nice. We want to see what kind of things happen on the ground to make the manufacturing environment better. But generally, manufacturing is shifting away from China. China manufacturing, right, it was a labor arbitrage. And labor costs are going up pretty dramatically in China now. The pipeline of people moving from villages to the cities in China has more or less dried up. It's slowed down to a trickle. So now, much like you saw with the IT service industry in Bangalore and other places, if you want to hire 10,000 people, you got to poach them. And that's a lot more expensive than hiring them directly from the field. So I think while India may not attract the lion's share of that manufacturing investment that's moving away from China, they'll get some of it, and that'll be very welcome. The last thing, I think we're seeing a faster implementation in India of reforms, and this is going to give American companies a lot more heart as well. And what I mean by that, so looking way back to 2004, when Congress shocked the world and shocked themselves by winning the national election in India and forming the government. Chidambaram, I'd met Manmohan Singh for the first time in my life just a few months before that in his office in the Rajya Sabha, and it looked like I'd been the first person to take a visit on him in probably a decade or something like that. He didn't know. Nobody knew in the Congress Party they were about to win, but they did. Chidambaram steps up in the budget speech in 2004 and says, there's 3 sectors we want to lift FDI caps in. It was civil aviation, telecom, and insurance. And it took 2 years, 3 years, and never for them to actually issue the rules for that. Now, earlier this year, you had an election. I'm sure you heard about it. Finance Minister Jaley makes his inaugural budget speech, and he lists 4 sectors for FDI cap increases. It was defense, it was railways, it was construction, and insurance again, and they've done 3 of the 4 already. So between taking 2 and 3 years from announcing a reform to implementing it to 2 to 4 months. So for foreign investors, you look at that and you realize, sure, not everything that we want has been done. I know Indian domestic industry would like to see a lot of the same reforms and other reforms. But, as a guy that's been doing this for a long time, I'm really seeing tangible changes. They announce a reform and they do it a lot faster than we've seen in the past. And for foreign investors that sometimes make that bet on India based on the presumption of continued reforms, seeing this happen faster gives them more heart. So let's talk about the possible game changers. That's all stuff that's pretty much on a steady state. It'll certainly increase trade and investment, but are the things that can kick it into a higher orbit. Well, we're not going to sign an FTA with India in the next 10 years, I don't think. I think the hurdles are too high. I think the United States has too many other FTA commitments right now that we're negotiating. But we do have a pending bilateral investment treaty. Talks began late in the Bush administration. They hadn't really progressed much because we decided to review our model treaty. India then decided to review its own, and we're waiting for the conclusion of that. But an investment treaty gives security that Indian companies investing in the United States and American companies investing in India will have additional security that if the government does something to impair that investment, that you can take them to international arbitration. And certainly for America to invest in India in big infrastructure projects, which we've largely stayed away from in the last 15 years, but yet the Modi government is very much committed to big infrastructure projects. If America is going to participate in that, an investment treaty would be a vital component to doing so. Second, if America continues its progress on becoming a large arms supplier, and in fact maybe at some point an investor in the defense industry in India. This one I could probably put in the first category as one of those steady state things, because again, going back 10 years ago, if I was giving a speech 10 years ago, we'd only sold one major defense system to India. It was a radar system that could see over mountains. That's nice. But now we've got a bunch of other, about $13 billion in total defense sales, and the expectation is that will continue. A lot of the big deals we've had have been to India's Air Force, but hoping to expand that to other branches as well. I think, again, if Modi is successful in his intentions on building out infrastructure and the ease of doing business, those are a couple of things that, it's great to hear him talk about it, but infrastructure you can't measure except by, 1, 2, and 10-year time frames. But if he's able to carry those things out to fruition and India's infrastructure gets better, then I think that's another time that you'll see American economic engagement with India really start to pick up. Prime Minister Modi is personally engaging with American CEOs in a way that we hadn't seen in the past. It sounds like a small thing, but again, a lot of companies came to India and had difficulty the first time around in making an investment work here. But the personal engagement there, I think, has had a pretty good positive impact. The buzz about what's happening here is penetrating in a deeper way than it had in the past. It's also important because in the past, whenever American companies had a problem with the investment environment, they had to use these weird structures that the governments had created, where our government talks to your government about business problems. And now we've got business speaking directly to the government, and the way that you have a conversation along those lines with Prime Minister Modi is you tell him how much you want to invest, and you tell him the problem you have with making that investment. And if execution happens on both sides, then this will unlock a lot more investment than we've seen in the past. And the last thing is FDI caps. If we see continued progress on lifting FDI caps, that opens the scope for what America can do for our economic engagement with India. There's still a lot of sectors, insurance and defense and retail, that have FDI caps. And I know these are controversial issues, but as these gets lifted over time, America will start to invest more and engage more with India. So those are some of the game changers that I see. Now, there's not without dangers. Looking over a 10-year horizon, what are some of the things that could actually take that train off the rail? And the first, and I've already touched on this briefly, is what if the trade deficit with the United States remains high? And over 10 years, again, as India moves into being our top 10, our top 5 trading partner, there could be political compulsions in the United States that would want to push back on India as a broader trading partner. Second, I mentioned the American business policy community, who doesn't feel quite as placated by some of the moves of the Modi government. And they're pressing our government to look at possibly even adopting trade sanctions against India because of the moves on local content rules, on patent issues, that kind of stuff. And what if they actually enact that and it happens? What if the United States actually begins some kind of mini trade war based on a small group of investors' concerns? The third, and I think this is kind of receding now, U.S. immigration legislation. There was a bill that got passed by our Senate, never taken up by our House of Representatives, but passed by one of the chambers of our Parliament, that would increase the number of H-1B visas, which I think is great for the relationship, but also decrease its usage by the heaviest users. And the heaviest users happen to be Indian companies, TCS, Wipro, Infosys, Cognizant. And so I think that's a dead issue now. I think the fact that the Senate has been taken by Republicans, so you see a leadership transition there. The bill itself is dead in the Senate because it was passed by the last Senate. I think the chances of damaging immigration legislation have receded somewhat, but we're talking about a 10-year window, and you never know what can happen over 10 years. Last thing I'll mention, and perhaps most importantly, is India's avoidance so far of being involved in major multilateral trade deals. Now, the United States right now is busy negotiating 3 of the largest free trade agreements that we've ever signed in the past. One is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes Japan and a wide range of Asian and American countries. The second is a free trade agreement with Europe that we call TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And the third, and this is one that people don't follow as much, but maybe even bigger than the other two, is the Trade and Services Agreement. This is a free trade agreement in services, which for the United States and a lot of economies makes up the vast bulk of the economy. It includes the United States, Japan, Europe, and about 20 other countries. So 75% of the world services trade is potentially tied up in this trade and services agreement. So if the United States signs all these deals, and we come up with lower cost and easier paths of doing business to all these markets, because that's what free trade agreements do. They make it easier to do business and lower the thresholds to business in those markets. And India is not a part of any of them. India is looking at some other groupings right now, but it's not part of the main ones that the United States is a part of. Then there could be a thing called trade diversion in the future. You know, as America looks to engage and as American investors look for the lowest cost paths to establish their lines of production and distribution, if India is an outlier because they're not part of these trade agreements and therefore, you know, duty rates remain high and such, then there could be some avoidance of India as America looks to invest in the region. So those are some of the dangers that I see out there. You know, hopefully none will come to pass. And I think on that last one, you know, signing the investment treaty will be one of those things that will, I think, kind of offset. At least we'll have a bilateral deal, even if India's not going to be part of these broader multilateral deals. So the waters aren't without dangers, but I think there's a lot more upside. Clearly, my list of positives is far longer than my list of negatives. And the good news is, I think, as we stand here today, the three groups that I mentioned in the beginning that care most about India's development, the development community, the business community, and the strategic community, are all very much back on the same page. We want to engage. We want to play a role. We want to help India to grow for very different reasons for all three groups. But I think all three are speaking from the same voice right now, which is kind of unusual for all three to be speaking kind of in the same voice at the same time. This is a relationship, though, which seldom swings on big deliverables. It's a long-term play. It takes a decade to measure progress sometimes. And I think over the next decade, I personally am quite bullish. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to taking your questions here. Okay.
A very good evening, sir. Sir, it has been quite some while since India signed the civil nuclear agreement with US back in 2005, and recently Prime Minister Modi and President Obama signed the contact group for this thing. So, can you shed some light as in how much more time will we take to actually implement this really fruitful agreement?
Yeah. So we signed the civil nuclear agreement in 2005. We announced the intention to have to initiate civilian nuclear trade. And by the way, I should mention, since I did in the beginning, even though I'm brought here with the U.S. government, I am not a U.S. government employee, and so my comments on all these things are my own. That's very important because I don't want somebody to believe that I'm speaking for U.S. government policy. I'm a think tank, so I'm meant to be like a watchdog and complain about the government. So we announced the agreement in 2005, and over the next several years, our parliaments agreed. We figured out the details for it. In 2010, your parliament passed a liability law that essentially, didn't put a cap on liability in case there's a problem. And here I sit on the 30-year, since the Bhopal disaster. We understand the reasons why it was difficult to put a clean liability law through Parliament. But nonetheless, when there's no cap on liability, it's impossible to establish the financing for what a nuclear plant would look like. So far, that's the main obstacle. The question is, would India have to amend its liability law and put a cap on, which is a very divisive issue. And the BJP, even if they support it, only has about 18% of seats in the upper house. So the numbers aren't really siding with the government, even if they wanted to do that. Is there an alternative arrangement that can be established outside the law as well? There's been some work that's been done on that in the past, and recently you might have seen when Prime Minister Modi visited the United States as part of the joint statement at the conclusion, we formally established a contacts group to work on this like hawks and spend all their time on it and see if we can find a way. So I can't tell you the answer. That work is ongoing. Will it be something apart from going back to Parliament and amending the liability law? That would certainly be easier, but it's got to be something that works because as is right now, I don't think you're going to see American or any foreign country contributing to India's nuclear power development in a big way.
Good evening, sir. My name is Ran Singh. I'm doing my MBA in IBS Hyderabad. I want to ask one question. When we look forward for a sustainable development, we go by ethics and environment. So my question is, as per some recent records, it is like China is creating 1400 square miles of desert every year. So, but the highest or the biggest partner in manufacturing of the United States is China in Asia. So, how do you look forward in shifting the partnership with China and India, or sharing the manufacturing industry within the states, within the countries?
Yeah. So how does India become a larger partner to the United States in manufacturing? Most of the answers, I think, the best that have been done so far, are included in the World Bank's Doing Business report. That points to all the obstacles there are for actually establishing and operating a business in India. And those obstacles are quite high. India ranks relatively low on that list, but this government is committed to really trying to bring that down. So, from somebody that's operated on behalf of a number of companies and seen, availability of electricity, right? You got to build a captive diesel power plant in India if you want to have reliable electricity. Labor law requirements, land acquisition is very difficult to do in India. Not to mention the licensing and other things. So, you're hearing some good things already on infrastructure and on licensing issues from this government. But that I think is the answers. Fixing those problems. There's no other. The labor rates are relatively good. The quality of labor, everybody that comes here is quite happy. There's certain industries like autos and pharma generics that have done extremely well in manufacturing. So it's not like you're starting from scratch and nobody's ever done well in manufacturing in India. It's just been a couple of pockets so far. So the question is, how can you expand that to other industries? And I think some of the things the government's talking about are on the right track. But it takes 1, 5, 10 years to figure out whether or not all that works.
Good evening, sir. I'm Suraj. My question is, Fed Reserve has completed its bond buying process now. So when do you think that Fed Reserve will increase its interest rate? And second thing is, how it is going to affect US and Indian market?
When will India increase its interest rate, or the United States?
US actually.
Oh.
It is a speculation that they'll be increasing next year. So when do you think that they'll be increasing it? And how it is going to affect the Indian and US market?
I think India can survive that just fine. I spend no time looking at my own country. I spend all my days and nights looking at yours. So speaking about American policy is a little bit difficult for me. But I will say, what you saw last year versus this year with tapering, right? The Federal Reserve announced last year that at some point in the future, they would slow down its purchase of the United States of bonds, which would cause bond rates to go up. And the reaction you saw in May, June, July last year in the Indian markets, FIIs withdrew, the rupee was under dramatic pressure, and that was only on the threat of tapering. And as of October this year, the Federal Reserve has actually carried out and concluded tapering. The Fed has stopped its bond buying program. And what's been the impact on Indian markets? Didn't even notice. Did not even notice. So I think even if the U.S. Federal Reserve does lift rates, and I have no idea whether or not they will, I think we've already had a good test example, which was the thing that scared Indian markets so bad and caused great consternation last year. India survived without a blink when it actually took place this year. So I think it's a pretty good test case, and I think companies are betting on India. It's one of the bricks that everybody sees higher growth rates than the year before and such. So I think that you're in a pretty good position, is my impression.
Good evening, sir. My name is Karthik. Sir, regarding pharma sector, US FDA is highly regulated and it's really strict regarding its policies and all. So actually, on an average, it is taking about 10 years for the for the approval of any of the new drugs, or to get our equivalent time to get approval for any of the for the production of the any of the generic drugs. So in the next coming years, do you feel anything that US FDA policies will be a little bit less, a little bit loosened, so that more pharmaceutical companies can actually develop?
Yeah, again, I know less about my policies than I do about yours, so I run a little bit of danger in talking about what the United States might do on this. But I will say, I think overall the fact that our government is paying a lot greater attention to India again, and that you see so many senior government-to-government meetings, that if this is one of the requests that your government has, and it's on a relatively short list and a priority list, then whatever is capable within the rules, within the law, we'll get some attention. So FDA obviously is engaging India quite heavily now, in reviewing facilities and all that, and they found problems in a number of them. So I think the idea about actually trying to make it easier to get licensed, it would be flying in the face about what the experience has been recently. But, you're right, we're talking about a 10-year time window here. And if suddenly FDA inspections find fewer and fewer infractions, then that kind of opens up the door maybe to expediting things beneath what is, allowable in the rules and law.
Good afternoon, sir. So my question is that as we know that IT sector is quite developing in India, and US has been the main client of the IT sector in India. Now my question is that with Modi coming up with Made in India policy, now with 10 years down the line, more goods will be produced in India, and again US will be being expected to be a country that would be like more imports will be coming from India. So won't you think that the trade deficit situation that you were talking about, that would be even worse in that situation?
It may be. Yeah. And we survive trade deficits with a lot of countries. China is our second largest trading partner. We have a major deficit with China. So it's not like you can't have a balanced relationship even in that context. And that's really where I mentioned the strategic group having a strong interest in India and India's development as part of a multipolar Asia becomes extremely important. And you look at the joint statement again from when Prime Minister Modi visited Washington, and it includes language about America helping India become more competitive in manufacturing. That flies in the face about political realities in the United States. Even though manufacturing is a small and shrinking part of our economy, it's still, when people talk about producing things, whether it's cars or IT or whatever, people still have the impression that that's what the basis of an economy is. It really isn't anymore. You can have a very vibrant services economy, and even though you're not making tangible things, you're creating economic value. But still, people still feel that building something is really the grassroots about what an economy is all about. And so, this idea about helping India become more competitive in manufacturing at a time that we're worried about losing our own manufacturing jobs is a critical statement, and it really shows that the strategic community sees India's rise, and manufacturing as a part of that, is vital for our own interest in Asia. So take that as no small point. The fact that we're willing to help India become more competitive in manufacturing is a critical point and shows this strategic community playing a big role in saying, all right, some member of Congress in the United States might lose a couple of votes because we're doing this, or the president might lose a couple of votes in the next election, but it's in our national interest, and manufacturing has got to be a part of India's next phase of development. So now let me touch on, and this is, again, a reminder, this is Rick Rosso, this is not, government or anything else. I think the idea of promoting manufacturing and IT is misplaced. I think you hear discussion about becoming a global major competing with, Taiwan and Singapore and places like that for high-tech manufacturing. It sounds very interesting, and it's exciting to think about. But at the same time, no country moved to the top of the list in manufacturing on day one. Most start, and I know this is painful to hear, but at the same time, look at what your next door neighbor Bangladesh has done in ready-made garments. A basic industry that doesn't require nearly the kind of capital infrastructure investment that, producing semiconductors does. And they've turned an industry that, Bangladesh 15 years ago was ranked nowhere in the world, and they're now number 2 in the world in the production of ready-made garments. And the great thing about basic industries, it employs a lot more people. If you talk about a semiconductor facility, if you go into an Intel semiconductor fab, it's mostly robots. There's 2 main interests that India has in talking about creating an IT manufacturing industry. One is to offset the dramatic import bill that you have of IT products, and the other is labor mobilization. Well, IT products only meets one of the 2. Basic industries, if India became more competitive and a larger exporter of things like ready-made garments and basic chemicals and food products and that kind of stuff, those are, they'll offset the trade deficit that your country has by exporting more, and also those sectors employ a lot more people. So I understand the attractiveness of trying to move to the front of the line and becoming a dominant technology production partner. And hey, I've seen India do incredible things. Your country is marvelous, and I'm sure it'll make inroads. But at the same time, in terms of like generating employment and doing things like that, there are other industries I think that I would actually meet that a little bit better. And hopefully you'll hear more discussion as well about that. Make in India, a lot of times people think, the technology and that kind of stuff. But actually, there's a lot of other industries that have a lower threshold to investment that would also generate greater employment. So my impression on this so far.
Good evening, sir. Recently, US has told India that India should apply brakes on the agreements with Russia that it's going to make during the meeting between Modi and the Russian president. So, can we expect that during the forthcoming visit of Obama to India, that US will be giving a lot of goodies and solving India's problems?
I think my impression is, looking forward to the president's trip in January. We just had a head of state meeting, and they signed a long agreement filled with a variety of different things that they'd like to do together. So I don't think they're going to look to create a new long agreement of different things to do together. I think if you want to see the agenda for the president's trip, probably the joint statement that was just signed 2 months ago is the best indicator about what's going to be included, and measuring progress on things that were included in there. So are they going to go above and beyond that? Maybe there could be a few things, I don't know. But for the most part, we just had that one meeting where they set the agenda for what we want to do together. So I don't think they're going to try to rewrite a brand new agenda. And some of the areas for what other foreign governments can do, in terms of massive development assistance, like what Japan is doing in developing the industrial corridors, the United States just doesn't have, the U.S. government doesn't have the resources for doing so. If we're going to contribute to those things, it's going to be the private sector, and that can't be negotiated by our president.
Good evening, sir. So here I have a question that economic growth is generally termed, we can compare it with the currency rate, right? So previously, a few decades ago, 1 rupee was almost equal to 60 US dollars, and now it's 62 point some US dollars, rupees is $1. So with the ties, economic ties, imports and exports, is it possible that in these next 10 years we have the same currency rate, that is 1 rupee is equal to 1 US dollar? That would be the right way of measuring the improvement in Indian economy. Not to mention that we are looking towards both the parties' development. So is it really possible?
If I knew which way currencies were going to go, I would be somewhere else right now. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure which way. I mean, you can make predictions, and based on economic growth, depending on the type of growth, it can go either way. But, generally, I think, we saw last summer one thing that you can almost take out of context and see that it had an impact on currency rates, which was foreign institutional investment. And as India grows, foreign institutional investors pour money into India, which means you've got more buyers of rupees than sellers, which, strengthens the rupee. But, at the same time, right, I mean, having a stronger currency sounds great, doesn't it? Based on the terms. But you know what it means? It means Indian products are more expensive to export. And so it actually hurts your exports. So it's one of those backwards kind of things. I know there's damages to having a weak currency, but at the same time, the United States, when we had our financial crisis and the dollar started to dip a bit, that actually aided American exporters, and we started to eat into the trade deficit that we'd had for many years. So I don't know which way they're going to go, and no matter which way they go, there's good and bad for both. So personally, I don't use that so much as a bellwether as to the relationship, unless you have a particular crisis like you did last year. Last year there was concern that multilateral rating agencies would actually downgrade India to junk status, because two of the three majors actually had India on the precipice of junk status. So there was some concern last year they'd get downgraded, and that would have its own impacts there. But otherwise, I don't know, and it could be good or could be bad.
Professor, sir, other than the FDI, what other change would the US government want in the economic policies of India, which would benefit both the nations?
Other than FDI caps? Well, I think other than FDI caps, probably the list that I would give is exactly the same list that your industries would give. Number one, goods and services tax. Right? GST, a constitutional amendment to take taxation rights away from states and give it to the central government. Of any economic reform that's on the table right now, and everybody that talks about economic reform should know this, of any economic reform that's been measured by a credible think tank or institution, this is the one that shows it will have the highest positive impact to GDP. The NIPFP did a study, and I think it was like 0.8 to 1.5% additional growth to GDP every year to infinity. You know, every country would love to have a magic wand that would give them that kind of growth with one move. But you're taking power away from the states. And India, obviously, you know, it's just like in the United States. States don't want to give up powers. So GST, you know, a great story that I heard a couple of years ago from one of India's largest manufacturers who was visiting Washington. We're talking about the GST. And, you know, he was talking about moving an auto component from Delhi to Mumbai. He said it got stopped 12 times by internal customs unions between those two places. 12 times. You know, what states does it go through? You know, Haryana, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, right? It's not like you got 12 different states even. And so, you know, so that's number one. You know, land. And I'm not going to say that they should amend the Land Acquisition Act, but something has got to be done to make easier availability and faster availability of land. And it could be amending the Land Acquisition Act. It could be, you know, for the government of India to free up a lot of the land that it holds, which there's some discussions about doing. You know, there's a variety of things that could be done. You know, Indian bankruptcy laws. That's one of the great drivers of innovation in the United States, you know, which is the life-death cycle. A really cool company, you know, gets launched, takes off, crashes and burns, and others come in and pick up the pieces, the intellectual property, the key talent. In India, Kingfisher Airlines is still traded on your stock exchange. And it goes up sometimes. So, yeah. So those are just a few of the things. Again, I mean, apart from FDI caps, and there's some areas where India still has customs duties issues and such, but for the most part, you know, America wants the exact same things the Indian industry does. But there is some competition there, right? You know, because sometimes India's companies don't want foreign companies to be competing in their space as well. So there is some pressures on the other side to keep some barriers in place here and there. But, you know, for the most part, it's very much a shared agenda.
Good evening, sir. Sir, I would like to ask you on the GST law, which is being implemented and it's stable. US investors seeing in the GST law and how it would affect the manufacturing industry and what are the different avenues they are seeing for the manufacturing industry which is lagging behind in India?
Well, you know, again, for GST, it's really about, I mean, if you've got a production line or even a sales and distribution line that crosses state boundaries, which efficient manufacturing will, you know, you'll find that one region of India is better at this part of your thing, that region is better than the other, then that increases the expenses, both, you know, in terms of keeping stuff on the road as it gets stopped at these borders, the cost of compliance with different tax jurisdictions, the difficulty in moving goods. So, you know, I think the values and benefits of a GST is really just about easing the sources of production and easing compliance. So again, it's not an American-related thing. You asked what America's interests are in this. It's really, you know, it's exactly shared between American and Indian companies. There's nothing preferential for foreign companies per se. For the most part, you know, versus 20 years ago, right? Your country's controls on foreign investment coming in and foreign trade are, you know, insignificant versus what I first experienced, you know, 17 years ago when I first started working with India. And so once the barriers against foreign companies are gone, then what's left? Exactly the same barriers that Indian companies face. There's probably one other that I'll mention, and again, this isn't a foreign company related issue, but in a lot of sectors, you still have government-owned companies in India that, you know, sometimes play a dominant role, sometimes are given special privileges versus others. You know, for instance, in the insurance business where I spent some time, Life Insurance Corporation, and this isn't meant to be a commercial, Life Insurance Corporation, if you buy a life insurance policy from LIC, it's backed by the federal government in India. And, you know, as a private company, you look at that and you're like, what can I do to match that? And so there are, you know, it's, again, it's not a foreign investor issue, but there are some advantages that are given to government-owned companies here and there, and that, you know, creates a less competitive environment, and not just for foreign companies, but for private companies as well.
Good evening, sir. Mr. R.C. Romola, who's watching this program online, he has a question for you. Can US help India in improving the quality of higher education?
You know, I think it's going to be at the margins. There will be some work that we could do, but I think it's going to be at the margins. There's some talk in India about actually lifting foreign investment caps on higher education, allowing foreign institutions to come in. What conversations I've had with America's largest educational institutions, they've dipped their toe in the water in overseas markets and setting up campuses in the past, and it hasn't been a great experience in all cases. So I don't know that even if India were to open up the door and allow foreign higher education institutions to come in tomorrow, I don't know that you'd see a big rush of foreign institutions coming in. I don't know that you're going to have a Harvard and MIT and other campuses, dotting every corner in India or something like that. But higher education, it's not just about four-year institutions. And probably the area where we've got some nascent cooperation that I think can be grown is on what we call community colleges. Technical education, giving people career skills rather than a broader education. And, this appeals to me very much. And I apologize as a foreigner that's speaking in this way about your country, but I've spent time in not just the big cities and the slums and such, but, outside of Patna. I don't know if anybody here is from Patna, but, you go just outside of Patna and there's a huge slum set up of, a tent city, families of 5 living underneath a tent. They moved to Patna because they thought they're going to make their fortune there. Right? Nobody makes their fortunes yet in Patna. It's got a lot more development that has to happen. And so I think the better role that America could have is this community college education. You go to a place like that and you find underskilled folks that just moved recently from being an agriculture worker and give them some skills to be a security guard, a healthcare worker, something that you don't need a 4-year degree to do. And so I've seen some great cooperation. In fact, the Wadhwani Foundation that funds my chair does a lot of work in this space on actually looking towards, technical skills development, community college type of stuff. And I think really for, in the last 10 years, more than 100 million people, or about 100 million people, have moved from villages in India to the cities. They're not going to go back and get a 4-year degree. And so I think the best that we can do, because I just don't think 4-year institutions are going to come in a big way. I think American cooperation, probably the best that we can do is actually giving, some of those job skills to folks that aren't ready for a 4-year degree. There would be some tie-ups, and a lot of educational institutions in India have tie-ups with the counterpart there, and there's some students moving back and forth. This is all good stuff, but this is marginal stuff, right? We're not talking about something that's going to transform your country or ours. But I think, community college and technical skills is something that can hit a much deeper portion of the population, is my impression.
One last question, perhaps. Anyone here? Sir, my question to you is, US is the largest consumer of the energy, sir. Why not the environmental issues are shared by US? Because one of the biggest problem between all the developing countries and the US is on the environment issues, sir.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is one of the trickiest issues to grapple with in our relationship right now, because we want India to grow, and this kind of gets back to the point about nobody ever leaped to the front of technology manufacturing. Nobody also ever leaped over coal and oil as the primary fuel for economic development, right? To build enough solar and hydro and wind and other things to fuel India's economic development in a first status, it's never been done, and it's very difficult to imagine, even with the reserves of those areas that are there, for India to do it. The United States is much less energy intensive than developing economies for each new, for economic growth, because, we do have the resources to move into some new areas. I think the Obama administration, even if we may not sign on to every international accord out there, has been focused as much as any administration could be on environmental issues. And so the support, which is a very politically sensitive issue in the United States, for solar and for things like that, we've really stepped into that area in a pretty big way. And, I think the shale gas revolution, too, it's a tricky issue, right, because it does pollute, but it pollutes at much less rate than coal-related energy or oil does. And so is it a gap fuel until we move to a cleaner economy, or is it, what we're going to use for the foreseeable future? So there's debates on all this in the United States. But I think, our energy intensity and the pollution that causes is, it's less than a lot of other countries now. We're starting to move in the right direction. But I think the root of your question probably is on the imbalance that we're going to have between the United States and India as we enter these talks. How is it fair for us to try to impose in India the same kind of rules that we would have for ourselves right now? And I think the best that we can do is try to be, supportive. We've got a U.S.-India energy dialogue right now, which is trying to share best practices for clean energy development. Again, shale gas, which is going to be better than the alternatives that India has right now. So this, again, I think there's going to be some work to be done around the margins there. I don't think anybody's come up with the perfect right answer for it, but I think, the United States and India actually have a lot of knowledge to share on this issue. So it's an area I think that we've seen some of the best cooperation in recent years between us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on the future of US-India economic ties. I now call upon the Vice-Chancellor, Professor J. Mahindra Reddy, to come onto the dais and hand over a memento to Mr. Rosso as a token of our appreciation and gratitude. Thank you, sirs. And thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. A special word of thanks to the US Consulate General, Hyderabad, for making this happen. I gratefully acknowledge the presence of Mrs. Shobha Rani Yashasvi, President of the ICFAI Group, and Mr. Gurdeep Singh, Assistant Public Affairs Officer, here with us. I also thank the University Administration for facilitating the program. Thank you, everyone.